Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session, which is a one-off session to examine the work of Active Travel England, an executive agency of the Department for Transport. Could I ask our witnesses to introduce themselves, please?
Chris Boardman, the Active Travel Commissioner for England.
My name is Graham Grant, the Director of Planning, Development and Strategy at Active Travel England and currently the Deputy Chief Executive.
Welcome today. So our first question, which I'll kick off our session with, what's the purpose of Active Travel England as an organisation?
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep this really brief. I know this isn't where we want to linger. You can start your clock now. That's absolutely fine. But I think it's really important to context what is the point, because some of these decisions are obviously very, very difficult. In essence, we've unwittingly over several decades designed health out of our streets, and now we're driving almost 9 billion more miles around our homes than we were just 10 years ago. And the implications of that are quite profound. So now we have a quarter of people who won't consider walking, wheeling or cycling for even really short journeys, which was my experience in Greater Manchester as well. And this is leading to things like 1 in 4 children now leaving primary school obese. Inactivity is now associated with 1 in 6 deaths in the UK. So it's actually a bigger killer than smoking now, at a cost of nearly $7.5 billion to the UK economy. And it's expected to rise further if action is not taken. So the burden on the wider economy is massive. 3 million people now classed as economically inactive due to long-term health conditions, and it's dampening our economic growth. We're 20% less active than we were in the 60s, and that's forecast to rise to 35% less active by 2030 if unchecked. That's about 1.25 minutes, Chair, I think. I think to move to something more positive, I think the payoff, so we've looked at what is the cost of the status quo. The potential payoffs are significant. We're currently working towards a 50% target, 50% of all trips cycled or walked. And if we get there, that is 4 million fewer sick days in every year. And the return value for money is absolutely enormous. The wider impact, it's 124 billion for the economy, the benefits, the potential benefits. That figure was updated this week, because we have been using, this is Treasury's appraisal methodology, because we have been using 2010 figures for value until earlier this week. Hence the figures, suddenly we've realised that the value of this is absolutely enormous.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing your sector into the wider context of other issues relevance to other committees, and particularly health, as you mentioned. So the organisation was established in mid-2022. What are you delivering that wasn't being delivered beforehand?
Well, Active Travel England was set up to address some of the barriers, some of which I've just touched on. Essentially, safety, culture and convenience are the biggest barriers. So 70% of people are saying we don't feel safe. So Active Travel England was set up by the Department for Transport to address the key issues that are in the way, and it has recruited just under 90 people now that have been working for just under 2 years to effect change. And we do that in 3 distinct areas: inspecting and ensuring the quality of infrastructure to make sure it actually meet standards that will make a difference. Something I would note that our local authority partners have been incredibly supportive of. This is something they want to do. To upskill and educate, we haven't had, there is very, very inconsistent, has been very inconsistent delivery because the expertise simply hasn't been there. That falls under our remit. And then simply informing, to be part of a conversation, this bedrock for most journeys, cycling or walking in particular, hasn't been there. Now we are part of weekly ministerial meetings. I advise the Secretary of State and other departments as well. And I would say that the progress in the first 2 years has been quite remarkable. I'll go on to that or leave
that. Probably our questions will bring more out. So, Catherine, over to you.
Well, absolutely on that, I'd I'd like to ask about how you think Active Travel England has grown and changed over the last 2 years, and whether you think the responsibilities of Active Travel England have changed.
I think the impact the organisation's had is, I'm getting close to using the word unprecedented. It's been an incredible value for money. We have, I'll let Graham speak to the planning part of our role, because that's his area. But we've used a system called capability ratings with local authorities. This came from 5 years of working in Greater Manchester for Andy Burnham as Active Travel Commissioner and Transport Commissioner, when we realised that just giving people or giving the local authorities the cash for a high-level ambition was leading to slow delivery. So we introduced what we call capability ratings, where a local authority assesses themselves, and then we moderate to look at all the things from political will, how many officers are employed, what have you actually already got in the pipeline, to go, okay, well, 4 would be rated, that would be Holland, level of ability to deliver. And nobody is a 4. There was a couple of authorities who were leading classed as 3, 2, 1 down to 0, which is have no interest in changing the status quo. And then we use that rating to match the type of resource and funding. So, for example, if a local authority said, okay, we want to do this high street for 20 million, and we go, well, you've never done anything like this before, you haven't actually got political consensus yet, you've only got 1 officer to do this job, you're going to fail if you do that. So deliver a set of crossings around a school, everybody will thank you, it's really good, you can deliver that with what you've got, and we will train you in the meantime. So by matching those 2 things together and taking that approach across the country, we trained 7,500 officers in the last 2 years. We have halved, correct me Graham if I've got this one, we have halved the delivery time of schemes of this size, because we have made sure that we have funded things that our councils are capable of delivering. So they have won, and in the meantime we've raised capability. So it's led to nearly a 10% increase in their capability, and we've increased delivery speed and efficiency. And it is a model that's now looking so attractive, and we did that in 1 year, not 2 years, that now it's being considered for much wider transport. It's one of the reasons that our CEO, Danny Williams, is not here, because he's now working on integrated transport for the greater picture.
And in light of what you've done, are your priorities changing going forward? I think your recent corporate plan didn't list your priorities beyond 2024, so it would be great to get a little bit more around your strategic priorities for 25-26.
Yeah, we are working on that at the moment, because the context has changed. Obviously, CWIS 3 also comes to an end in March, CWIS 2, which is the Cycling Walking Investment Strategy. So that's a statutory document that ends in March of this year. That needs to be redone and will become the new basis for our corporate plan moving forward. There's obviously changes in terms of devolution that are coming forward, the government's health missions and other such things. So at the moment we are working with our minister about what our corporate plan looks like from 25 to 29 to take into account the changes to the Cycling Walking Investment Strategy, but also the Integrated National Transport Strategy. And we're trying to dovetail the 2 to make sure that at the point in time where the strategy and the policy is confirmed, that we are set up as an agency to be able to deliver that. To your point in terms of the question as to how we've grown, we've come from about 30 people in 2022 to 90 now. Our staff profile has changed from being 29% female in 2022 to 47% female now. The scope of what we've done has changed as well. So obviously at the start we were just looking at active travel funding, and to Chris's point about delivery, our most recent funding round showed 45% of construction schemes were delivered within 21 months, which compares to only 11% of comparable local transport schemes from the Levelling Up Fund. And again, to the point of what we've been doing, we've been linking funding with quality standards, and the role of our inspections is to make sure that the funding only goes if the scheme is good enough to be delivered, and that's driving up the quality, and the quality of that ensures that there's a really important stat that we've been working on that shows that we've seen a 500% improvement in schemes meeting minimum quality standards from when we started to when we end. And then we can also tie that through to the fact that a better quality scheme sees more people using it. We don't just look at our own funding anymore. Through a sponsorship model, we get involved with other departments as well to help them look at things like levelling up schemes. We're also embedded in the Department for Transport's major road network and large local majors committee to look at big schemes as well, to make sure that they're maximising the opportunity for active travel. We're involved in planning, which we might touch on later. And another key thing that we've been doing is trying to standardise data sources so that in the future we've got a really good opportunity to be able to look at anything across the country in a standardised way so that we understand what impact the schemes are having, how quickly people are delivering and what efficiencies we can help them make.
You mentioned that you now meet with ministers on a weekly basis. Obviously, there has been a change of government. Has that changed your working relationship with government, and has it changed or impacted on your priorities?
The political landscape has fluctuated quite considerably since we were formed. In fact, almost from day one, we had a very strong mandate and direction to increase levels of cycling. We're a very clear target, 50% of journeys cycled or walked by 2030, dedicated budget to achieve that. And we were really clear on the purpose of that. So that would be 3.1 million more journeys, people active, more people active. We estimated that would reduce GP visits by about 2 million, reduce sick days by 4 million. So we were really 4 million. So we were very clear on our purpose. And then very quickly, as ATE became established, the political priorities shifted. I think what Active Travel England did extremely well was adapt to that environment. And because we were working with local authorities and we were enabling them to do something, I think it's a really important point, that they already wanted to do. So we estimate, we've looked at all the local cycling walking investment plans around the country, what they have chosen to design and what they want to plan for, and it's between 15 and 20,000 miles. So that is, our client base, if you like, didn't change with the politics, and they still needed assistance with good design. And obviously some funding. So although our funding fluctuated massively, the mission didn't change because it was embedded in local communities. So as we've moved through the political changes, that client base and our role has remained steadfast. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question completely. Certainly the funding changes has impacted us in terms of that 50% by 2030. Well, 2030 is getting more and more challenging, and that's a decision above my pay grade. But it hasn't helped. And devolution is now here to stay, so we're adapting yet again to less central funding, more devolved funding, and how to help local authorities stay on track with the myriad pressures they have within a transport settlement. We've got ideas for that, though.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. Just a quick follow-up before I go to my question. The regular meetings with ministers and transport is really good, but you started off talking about health benefits. Do you have meetings with ministers or officials from other departments to talk about the benefits of what you're doing?
So I'll preface my answer with 2 years in existence. So it is, we are building a lot of relationships. So we directly benefit at least 8 government departments and nearly all of government's missions. So we have reason to go and interact with lots of departments. We are quite restricted on headcount. So if in the planning system, and Graham can talk to the scale of what's been achieved with very few people, our public affairs function has largely been me. So we have some fantastic allies. Chris Whitty is one of our main and very active supporters because he sees the clear benefits of building health back into streets. The regular meetings with ministers, so there's a weekly operational meeting with ministers which Graham and the team attend. I advise the Secretary of State directly. I'm essentially employed by the Secretary of State. Had an excellent relationship with Louise Hay. I now am very confident it's exactly the same with Heidi Alexander. So that's very strong. And reaching out into the Department for Education and also DCMS. Some people may or may not know I'm also the chairman of Sport England. And the title is sport, but it's actually activity is what Sport England's about. So we already have good reach. I think there's room for a lot more.
Yeah, it's good that these things are connecting up, though. Yeah. So on to my questions. So what are the barriers right now to you delivering some of the change that we need?
There is 3 main barriers to uptake. I mean, that number one is safety. 70% of people are telling us that safety is the biggest reason. So that is key. And that can be achieved in a number of different ways, but that is by far the biggest barrier. Culture. So I talked about at the start, designing this out. The cultural change that it is stopping becoming something that people like me do. And so the culture is the first step is actually, it's a bit grim out there, so the first step leads to a car. And the impact of this is enormous, and I won't go too far down this road, but if somebody's first step becomes more and more becomes to a car, and I mentioned that 9 billion more miles being driven, then I'm no longer a potential client for public transport. So that investment suffers. Yeah. So this is your catchment. So the culture change, I visited a school last year with the previous Secretary of State, and it struck me that the children were talking to me about what they like to do, and when asked about, would you like to be able to scoot or cycle to school, I realised that they'd never even considered this as an option because they didn't know that they were missing out. Whereas 200 miles from here, 63% of kids get around under their own steam every day, and we have lost that. So the culture is a real concerning one. And I think the last part really is convenience. Probably, in a large sense, the most important one. We'll do the easiest things. That's how we are built. And if it's not an easy choice, then the incentive to change just isn't there. So there are the three main things: safety, culture, and convenience.
May I add to that? I think that the barrier also depends on your own personal circumstances. And this is something that our Minister's been very keen on, particularly in terms of ensuring accessibility and inclusion for people who have mobility impairments or disabilities as well. Because one of the biggest barriers to being able to get around there is fundamentally the quality of pavements. That's the number one barrier for disabled people accessing transport. 77% of all respondents to a survey by Transport for All, who represent all the people with all manner of disabilities in terms of their needs from the transport system. And obviously the barriers to children might be different as well. So that's one of the things that we look at in terms of the way that we inspect and assure schemes. We look at making sure that we are trying to help local authorities design in accessibility and inclusion at the earliest possible opportunity. And as I'm speaking, I'd also point out in terms of how do we reach across to Department for Health and Social Care and so on. Our Minister met recently with Andrew Glynn, I think, from Department for Health and Social Care, and they're building on that relationship. And Chris, you're hosting a roundtable in mid-February on the health mission, which brings together both Department for Health and Social Care and Department for Transport, where we try to look for opportunities to work together to deliver things more efficiently.
That's good. I mean, and I think Andrew Glynn gets this, to be honest. Another slide. I mean, you talked about people with disabilities access and transport. So I have to mention this. Where is Active Travel England on a pavement parking ban, giving councils the power to implement something?
Again, that's above our pay grade, and but it is a very live issue for ministers. It's been actively considered at the moment. I know Edinburgh has done. Took some amazingly bold, or has Scotland actually, amazingly bold action. There's a lot to learn. I think how we address this, there will be a lot of pressure because we have allowed pavements to be used as overflow parking for a long time outside of London. And so to change that will be difficult. So how we frame that, I think, is really important, so people go with us. Again, it is Lillian Greenwood, the Minister responsible. She is looking at this actively at the moment. But we have discussed things that something we've not been good at in the past is saying, well, we want to make sure that every pavement is usable and will want to be used by a parent with a double buggy. And then something that the public can context why this is important to me and what we are trying to achieve. And then you can get down, once you've made that emotional connection, to what is required. Some of that will be lime bikes parked on pavements. Somebody will be cars parked on pavements. We're really going to look at EV charging as that comes online, because we could unwittingly clutter the pavements and lock in behaviour that's not beneficial to us. So it's a really live issue, and ministers are looking at it actively now.
Good, and it's good you're having those discussions. So where should we focus then if we're really wanting to deliver these health objectives you're talking about, walking or cycling, if you were to choose your favourite child?
Well, I think so. Walking will always do the heavy lifting. It is the majority of active journeys. and the average walking journey is 0.8 mile, which and then it becomes less convenient, it's too much time, for many different reasons it drops off. The average cycling journey is 3.8 miles. So walking is the one that we can get to quickly, we can do a lot with, we connect with a lot of people. It is of the two, so relative, of the two, it is the least beneficial in health terms. It is the most beneficial in getting somebody from nothing to something. So in that sense, it's beneficial. After that, the health benefits are less than cycling, which is slightly more vigorous. I think the important one to note is if we think about this in integrated terms, which is the work I'd started to do in Greater Manchester for the B network before I left, then you realise that if you have a good network and encourage active travel, as happens in other countries, that 3.8 miles means that I can increase the catchment for public transport 20-fold. If I make that parking convenient, if I make the route safe and consistent, then it isn't just the short journeys. I can actually feasibly make an attractive longer journey mixing modes, and therein lies, I think, the real potential. So one is a lot easier to address than the other, but the benefits of one are significant and get us much wider, bigger ripple effect.
Okay, Ollie.
Here, really refreshing to hear you talk about that, because as you all know very well, in the Netherlands, most stations have got parking for thousands of bikes, and then, as you say, massively increases the public transport catchment area. So really refreshing to hear someone in authority with influence with such good knowledge and making such great points. There's lots of things to promote active travel that can be done. So infrastructure is one, cycle training programs like Bikeability are another, and then there's perhaps the wider culture and planning context. What work is Active Travel England doing to understand the effectiveness of those differing types of interventions in relation to encouraging walking and cycling?
Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question. One of the things that Active Travel England is doing is regularly commissioning data from local authorities now to actually understand, did it work? And that, before the Department for Transport recognised this deficiency. We didn't know how much impact. In fact, I think it was the Public Accounts
Committee.
Yeah, an inquiry a couple of years ago found that that we didn't know how the money was being spent, and so now we are actually actively going and finding out what works. So we know, for example, we now know LTM 120, and we're producing guidance notes all the time based on what we've now found works. So we're constantly updating. We know that you can build the most amazing piece of infrastructure, don't do those junctions because it's a bit difficult. Well, you've just wasted a lot of money because that won't get used.
Absolutely.
Because of the brakes. So we have, using our own funding, made sure that you have to do it all or don't bother, because it's a waste. In fact, there is emerging research that we have done now looking at a large number of schemes of designing the old way. So painted white line, stop at the junction, it's a bit difficult, another painted white line, versus building to LTM 120 standard. And the data, Active Travel's data at the moment, is showing that building the old way is actually increasing risk. To be slightly melodramatic, you're killing more people than doing nothing at all. And you're getting no uptake either because people don't feel safer. We now know if you build to LTM 120 and properly and consistently, we're seeing figures 60% plus uptake, increase in uptake, and we're seeing a halving of KSIs. So that data is now, because DFT has established a specialist unit, we are gathering that information at pace, and then it's going back to local authorities, and we're trying to speed up by producing advice notes so they get updates quite regularly, as opposed to waiting for guidance, statutory guidance, which can take a very long time.
That picks up a lot on the infrastructure, and the point about behaviour change is really important too, and it speaks to the question that we had earlier on about areas that we might expand into more within the next corporate plan. We've spoken about data, so to use some of the data points as to what we've collected. In 23-24, the ATE-funded Walk to School outreach project delivered by Living Streets resulted in a 37% mode shift to active travel, with pupils and their parents logging 9.3 million new walking journeys, which removed 1.8 million car kilometres from roads at peak times. An increase in funding of that of £5 million in 25-26 will still only enable approximately 10% of primary schools in England outside London to be reached. So that's one of the things that we're discussing with ministers and within the context of the roundtables that we talked about earlier. Also, 2/3 of authorities in England outside London take part in something called Mode Shift Stars education scheme. In 23-24, on average, schools accredited at the top very good level saw active modes of travel increase from 53.8% to 58%, which is a mode shift to 7.7% or 4.1 percentage points. The programme is estimated to cost less than 1p per stage, and they're the areas that we want to try to build in to make sure that we can add more value for local authorities into the future. One point I would make is that in 2024, a study led by, I think it was University of Westminster, there was a systematic review about interventions, about changing behaviour in terms of travel behaviour, and what that resulted in is a very clear position that sustainable active travel behaviour change is only achieved, or is best achieved, when you mix behaviour change measures alongside built environment changes in the environment at the same time, so that when you're trying to engage with people, they actually see that they've got a safer route that they can use, and that means that you will lock in the behaviour a lot easier.
Yeah, that's very clear. Just a question about bikeability. I mean, the evidence about bikeability's effectiveness in terms of reducing injuries is very well established. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly a few years ago, a lot of councils used to offer free adult cycle training. That seems to have been cut back quite a lot in a lot of places. In Oxford, for example, I saw a press release from the county council saying, yes, we're doing this, but it's a one-off. Do you think there would be value in investing in more in adult cycle training in addition to child-focused bikeability as a way of getting some of that culture change, behaviour change?
Well, I think budget restrictions are there's a lot of things we can do. We have to choose which ones are going to give us the most bang for our buck, which one's the most effective. To build on both that and what Graham's just said, bikeability training is really effective, and if you, at whatever age, if you combine that with the creation of infrastructure and the ability to feel safe, then the two things going together, you get a huge increase in take-up. So if you ask, I think the percentage of parents is in the 90% of parents that would like their children trained. But if you say, would you let them ride to school? And then it drops quite dramatically. So if you combine targeted training with infrastructure together, then you can actually get a shift that sticks. In terms of adults, we know that the impact of adults taking bikeability training and then continuing to ride afterwards is very high, because it's a conscious decision to take that training. So I think in the round it's more a case of where we spend our resource, but we're getting much better at knowing what interventions work. There's certainly a lot of evidence around walking that Graham alluded to that say these interventions work. What we need is that we need interventions that don't just get people involved in something new and interesting, that when we move away, it continues. And that's where we've got to do the two things together.
You say what we need is putting the bikeability, the training in with the physical changes, but are you initiating that or encouraging that in the programs that you're doing? It's a good idea, but...
Yeah.
Yes, we are, but it's local determination to highways authorities and mayoral combined authorities as to what they want to focus on. One of the things I would note is that only a matter of 3 weeks ago, myself and some of my colleagues met with the active travel leads for all of the urban transport group areas to discuss exactly what we've just been talking about there in terms of the development of a programme that would pick up both maintenance and other such things. And many of them are already doing it. I think one of the things that's really important is to recognise that within the context of devolution, that is a transition as well. You know, having worked in local authority for many years myself, different local authorities and different mayoral combined authorities are at different stages of their evolution as well. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to make sure that we understand their needs by talking to them and tailor what we offer them based on what they need. You know, areas that have been devolved for longer, like Greater Manchester or perhaps West Midlands, for example, are in a different situation than those that are just starting out on that journey, and therefore the type of support or network planning that we would offer them might be different on that basis as well.
And maintenance and training are revenue spend, whereas infrastructure change is capital, and local authorities treat them differently. Is that part of the challenge in putting the two together at the same time?
Yeah, it can be. And having experience of leading a highway authority, you know, it is really difficult to make sure that you're on top of absolutely everything that's happening. And even little things like, for example, making sure that if you are just doing a road resurfacing, that you don't put in place lines and signs that don't meet new guidance and so on. So it is an issue, but different local authorities have different ways to try to approach it. I think
the learning aspect of having essentially a centre of excellence with Active Travel England, we can actually, because we are commissioning and gathering data, we would, when we had more centralised funding to direct, we would make sure the two things go together, because we know that if ambition is low, it's much easier to go and train kids to ride a bike in a playground, and parents like it. It looks like you're doing something, but the actual outcome that we want is not being heavily affected. Whereas if somebody's actually doing the hard yards and producing the safe space to get to school, then in that area will work, and we would be more inclined to fund people who are doing both. Now it's regional, it's still effective because we can supply that information to local authorities and make it, get a spotlight on it. If you're just doing that and not that, it's not very efficient.
Thank you. So sometimes the media can be focused on a kind of never-ending argument between cyclists and drivers, and I find that quite depressing at times. But is Active Travel England done any work to actually find out what real people actually think about the kind of interventions you want to promote, as opposed to what we see sometimes in the media? Yeah.
Yes, we did some quite extensive focus group work last year to understand what motivations, their thoughts. A lot of it was affirmation, which is not unhelpful, of things we already believed, but it was great to get it confirmed. And we found that when you talk to big numbers, so I mentioned over 120 billion to the economy, these were the kind of things that we put in front of focus groups, and it had no resonance because it didn't touch my life. And I don't believe that number. I don't know what it means, and I'm even getting slightly irritated now because I need to pay my mortgage. But when we talked later on about giving your children transport independence, the thing that other people a few hundred miles from here just accept as normal, giving them the freedom to stay at after school clubs. When I mentioned the double buggy test, every pavement must be usable by a parent with a dog, and they would want to. For cycling, a 12-year-old test, must be usable and want to be used by a competent 12-year-old, and their parents would let them. When you describe difficult things in those ways, and it connected very strongly. In fact, the majority of the focus groups were leaning in and starting to electively tell you what they would give up to have that. So this topic is, and has always been, despite segments of the media, and perhaps I'll come back to that in a moment, it has been popular. 80% plus support consistently for more active travel, more cycling and walking provision. People want it, it's popular. The media aspect, we have a concerted sector of the media now that is portraying cycling in particular as being something that is taking away from you, and when in fact we're trying to give more transport choice because we've lost the options to actually do differently. So that part of it, that hearts and minds bit, is actually probably more important than anything else, because you don't get to build anything if people don't want you to. So we are just starting to mature in that and realise the importance, and you can see its importance in wider politics, but that's far beyond this committee's brief.
We're running 2 webinars in the coming weeks actually to help train communications professionals in local authorities about the findings of the research that Chris just mentioned, and it's already the second most popular that we've had, even though it hasn't taken place yet in terms of the number of people who've signed up in advance to take part in it.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. So as part of the issue how these schemes are promoted, so I think traditionally a scheme would be consulted on and then implemented. There'd be some pushback as people got used to it, then they would come to terms with it, over
Yeah.
a 6-month period. But now, more and more, particularly with the LTN type approach, we implement a scheme and then we seek feedback over a number of months, sometimes as much as 18 months. And does that kind of framework isn't it just ideal for creating a campaign against these schemes? Because you're saying this is an ongoing conversation, rather than really asking people to look at the scheme and come to terms with it and figure out how they benefit from it. You understand that the two approaches?
There are different strengths and benefits to the different routes that you can take in terms of traffic regulation orders, which is what you're referring to. So you can either do an experimental traffic regulation order, which enables you to put in place a measure and then see how effective it is, or you can consult in advance and then determine exactly what you're going to do thereafter. Having delivered both, there are strengths and weaknesses for different ways of looking at it, but one of the benefits of the experimental approach, which has been used for decades as well, it's not to think that this is just new. Yeah. A lot of pedestrianisation in major high streets in the 1980s or otherwise were done using exactly the same methods. Is that it gives you the opportunity to listen to people and to determine whether or not there are knock-on implications that you need to actually intervene on. And one of the things that we've done is try to develop tools that enable local authorities to plan as best as they possibly can. So we've got a route area check tool which enables people to look at what changes they might be making, and then it identifies where the knock-on implications might be so that they can go and look at that as well. So we're trying to make sure that they've got efficiency in their planning, but different routes have different benefits and issues with.
Yeah, I think doing public opinion work, serious public opinion work, rather than just listening to the loudest voices, is key actually to actually understand what people think. So moving on to safety. So how much of a barrier is the safety to people to actually starting walking and cycling more? Thinking particularly about more vulnerable people and people who are moving when it's in the evenings, etc. How much of a challenge is that? And do your design standards try to alleviate those challenges?
I think it's as we discussed earlier, is the biggest fear of personal safety is the big, and it actually goes wider than infrastructure and traffic. It is, women don't feel safe at night, even on quiet local roads. So there's a much wider safety issue. So that is the biggest barrier to address, and it's one we need to address first, and then we can build all the activation work on top of that. Underpinning that actually is the desire to change, which we've just touched on, which is absolutely fundamental, and the ability to consult better, I think it is absolutely key, because then we get to try new things, and some of it is very simple. So narrowing the radiuses of curbs at the mouth of a side road and reducing the distance to cross, things that you don't actually acknowledge or see consciously, but you would notice if you're walking across that road, and there might be 20 of those on the way to a school, and because of that, parents go, do you know what, I'll run you there. So one of the interventions that we're looking at now, in fact we started back in 2018 in Greater Manchester, is the possibility of using zebra markings across the mouth of side roads.
Yeah, long overdue.
Reinforce the highway code. There's actually a few outside this building. Westminster is experimenting on it now if you want to try it for yourself. At the moment that's not possible in our guidance without zigzags, police beacons, etc., which make it very, very expensive. And that's an intervention that we're particularly interested in. Ministers are very keen on it as well, because we could act quickly, cheaply, to transform the school run, give parents confidence to let their kids walk. Greater Manchester commissioned the Transport Research Laboratory in 2019, to conduct a full package of research, paper exercise, off-road trials, on-road trials, and found that 65% or more cars stopped when that was there. They were overwhelmingly popular with the public. There was no increase in collisions. So that's got real potential, a simple thing, very subtle, that reinforces the right of way, gives people confidence. And that's elderly people, that's the disabled, that's somebody who's a little bit frail. All of the people at the moment, we mentioned earlier, to get from nothing to something, the small interventions that we can make locally that change those school runs and just get into the shop.
Just one very quick question. So you're right there, of course, to highlight, motor vehicles is a significant risk to people in urban areas, particularly children go to school, etc., and we're all concerned about that. But of course, the media will also focus on dangerous cyclists.
Yeah.
And as somebody who, I do like to think I'm a sensible cyclist, there's nothing depresses me more than a cyclist going through a red light or zipping through a zebra crossing even outside this building. Do you think we should be doing more to enforce safer cycling as well?
I think I'm very glad you raised it. I think it's an excellent question. I think yes is the answer. Where I would spread out slightly the context for that. So at the moment, the actual danger is of pedestrian KSIs involving a cyclist is a fraction of 1%. It is a fraction of 1%, and I have hyperbolic, I know, but in the press, I have actually said there are more people killed by cows and lightning than cyclists. And I know that sounds incredibly crass. I think in my position, my mother was killed in a road traffic accident. I'm one of the few people who can do that because that contrast needs to be made. That said, perception is critical, because that perception, whether I feel intimidated, changes whether somebody makes a journey, particularly the partially sighted or disabled. Actually, am I going to make this journey in the first place? So perception is really important. So to answer your question, I think we should be doing more. We have laws at our disposal already. We don't need new laws. What we should do is take it in the round to reduce road danger. Yeah. Not increase safety, that's a different thing. Everybody's safe if nobody walks or cycles. There's no accidents. So we mean reduce danger. And I think this should be part of a wider campaign to look at where are the real dangers, what is the evidence, what is stopping people, and then focus in on that. Otherwise, if we go for what is in the press at the moment and deal with that one thing, does society benefit or lose out? So the context, I think, is really important.
Yeah, thank you.
Alex, you wanted to come in?
You were talking just before about focus groups and also sort of how you are the media for your organisation. I was wondering about the name of the organisation of Active Travel England. Do you get the impression that people out there have the faintest idea what active travel is? And what do you do to try and explain what it is? And would it be better perhaps if we were just talking about cycling and walking, which I think that most people do know what that is?
I agree with that completely. I think active travel has to be explained. It's one of the things we ran past focus group, and people. It doesn't mean anything outside of our industry, outside of this sector. We don't know what it means. So now we are actively changing to using cycling, wheeling, walking all the time now for that very reason. In terms of the name of the organisation, I was just speaking with another colleague, and I can't divulge what they come up with because they're going to launch it in the next few days, and it was very good. And it just spoke to the reality. And I think that's really important. I think acronyms are something to be avoided, because if I might just go slightly sideways, but it's exactly the same point, the term LTN now makes people controversial thing. When we know, thanks to the previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's report, actually, we stopped counting at 25,000 around the country. It's an old thing. Imagine if we'd called them child safe zones, which is what that does, and don't let it get reduced to an acronym. I think we would have been in a very different place. So active travelling, I would agree with you. I think we just have to decide whether the view is worth the climb in terms of going back and changing that. But yes, in terms of our language, we are changing it for that very reason.
Can I just go back to the issue of safety and what puts off a lot of people walking and or makes them nervous at particularly at junctions and so on, and also why a lot of people don't cycle more, is driver behaviour. The last government, to their credit, did change the highway code and brought in the concept of the hierarchy of vulnerable road users. Really good stuff, and our junction rules now comply with most of the rest of the world. But do you have a view about how that could actually be embedded better in driver culture?
Yes, to a degree. I mean, a lot of the issues that we are dealing with are managing things that probably shouldn't exist in the first place, and we are not enforcing the rules that we've already got, the laws that we've already got consistently, and to drive the behaviours that we want to see. So, for example, I mentioned side road zebras, but we had everybody using our roads complying to it as a pedestrian's right of way if they're crossing or intend to cross, then we wouldn't need it. You know, so we're potentially going to spend millions, hundreds of millions on doing something just to enforce something we shouldn't need to enforce. So it's much bigger than us. When we talked earlier, a wider engagement with wider government, I think that the ability to police consistently to make sure that there are consequences.
Sorry, Chris, obviously you agree with it.
Yes,
but,
I agree.
Okay. But does Act to Travel England have a role in encouraging government, etc., to look at this? Have you discussed this with ministers?
I think in terms, and Graham I think will build on this, internally yes. I think that's to make sure, so I'm involved in road safety roundtables and strategy coordination now. And I think that's internally the role we can play. The actions are for partner departments and organisations to take, but we are now a voice that can illustrate that.
Okay. Right. I think it's... sorry, Lawrence. Sorry, my apologies.
You, Chair.
Too many lists.
Graham, going back to your comments on disability participation and working with local authorities, what does that work look like in practice? And do you monitor disability participation and set targets in this regard?
So authorities have a legal responsibility to design roads to be accessible. What we do is to try to make sure that the toolkits that we create for them take this into account, so when they use them. So, and it's not just, for example, it's not just on accessibility. We also design in the best practice that we can find on things like neurodiversity as well, to make sure that we're incorporating that within our planning guidance and other street design toolkits. We don't set targets specifically on the number of people with disabilities who should be using a scheme. That's not really our role. What we do is try to ensure that from a monitoring and evaluation perspective that we're providing good advice to local authorities and that we're providing a consistent means by which they can report on it. We have pioneered now a system that was launched just before Christmas, which enables every local, well, we're piloting it at the moment, but over 80 local authorities now to basically put in the information that they've got into an online system that then means that they only have to report on it once. We're trying to extend that across other different ways of working as well. We're also doing advice at the moment on various different specific types of infrastructure that have been prominent in reporting at the moment as to people's perceptions or issues to do with safety. So we're working with the government to try, well, with DFT to try and design guidance on that. What we do is we take it into account in terms of the toolkits and the design guidance that we create, and we try to advise people as to how best to deliver inclusive and accessible schemes. And we also train our staff in it. So, for example, Chris mentioned earlier on the point about safety of women and girls. We had all of our designers or inspectors and planners trained in the latest thinking in that just before Christmas as well, to make sure that they carry that into every element of the work that they're doing and also into the development of the tools that we're creating for local authorities.
Thank you. Are all of those toolkits in the public domain?
They're on our website. They're available, and our website is effectively at the moment a one-stop shop. It gives you access to the webinars that we've previously done, and one of the things that we've also done is pull together all of the different advice as to how people might plan different types of housing developments from a master plan down to a street level. What we've done is taken all of the advice from various different government documents and put it into a really easy to understand and navigate format so that designers from any local authority can easily find the best practice examples and advice just through our website really quickly.
I think you've touched on it, but do you take a view on the merits of particular types of schemes? So I'm thinking in particular bollards on streets which can prevent pavement parking but then can be hard to navigate for some road users, and floating bus stops which can be convenient for some cyclists but less accessible for cyclists with visual impairments. Do you take a view on whether local authorities should be making those types of interventions?
It's their legal responsibility and it's their roads, and therefore they are the ones who have to take the decision. We provide them with advice as to what pitfalls to avoid and how best to design things. So our design toolkits, for example, take into account what we call critical issues. These are the 10 most critical safety issues that you could design into a scheme. You need to avoid them. if people come to us for funding, or to other areas of government whose funding we look at as well, and they've got elements of these critical issues in there, what we would do is flag that up and say that these need to be resolved before government should consider giving you funding. And that's the way that we approach it in terms of trying to make sure that we're helping support local authorities design out these issues at the earliest possible opportunities. On floating bus stops, we've been asked by the Minister to make sure that we come up with some guidance as to how best
rapidly
to ensure. And we've engaged with the local authorities and urban transport group areas who are most prominent in terms of where these things feature to ensure that they're looking at them themselves as well.
Sorry. About half of those bus stops are in London, the bus stop bypass. We're looking at those actively. The Minister is really keen, and we're very supportive to help make sure that designs work properly, because there is inconsistency, and that's very live at the moment. We've looked at the actual safety, that perception and actual. So we think there's about 3 billion bus journeys in London a year to one collision. But that perception one is really live and really important. And designs can be better, and we're working on that. And then operationally, we are actively working now to include the disability community in the design, at the design stage. Not, here's what we've done, what do you think, the consultation method. Actually, you be involved and help us with these hard compromise choices. Where would you go? So we're involved with DIPTAC, the DFT's advisory body. I have Isabel Clement, who's a wheelchair user, sitting on my board. So we have that advice, and we're ramping up our engagement with those organisations to help us get it right in the first place. That lived experience is critical.
We've also been doing pilots and so on to look at how technology can aid us in this. So there is a trial scheme outside, I think is it Manchester's?
Outside the blind school in Manchester,
yeah. We've got floating bus stops just over the bridge here that I've used, and I could suggest possibly the zigzags in front of the zebra crossing to make it clear that people on bikes have to give way to the pedestrians crossing to get to and from the bus.
Yeah, I agree.
Alex.
Thank you. So how does your approach to increasing cycling and walking differ between, say, cities and market towns and more rural areas?
Well, one of the things that I would note is that the local transport node 120, LTN 120, which has been referred to earlier on, is more predominantly focused on urban areas. So one of the things that we are doing at the moment is effectively a bridging document to say how do we take the principles of this note and apply it to a more rural or semi-rural area. That's one of the things that our customers in terms of local authorities have asked us for, and so that's one of the things that we're working on at the moment. We look at the merits of each funding bid based on its own merit. Yeah, and try to determine what we think would add value in the best possible way. I'm going to try to find a stat. I do have a stat as to where a lot of our funding has gone. But what we have tried to do is to make sure that we engage with all authorities, not just those. It is clear that urban areas have the highest propensity and potential to change more trips towards walking, cycling and public transport, but that doesn't mean that we don't focus on rural areas as well. We make sure that we've got an agent in every area of the country who will go out and speak to local authorities about what they need best.
I think there's 2 points. When I last appeared in front of this committee, I was asked a question about what about rural areas. So there's 2 bits. I think the first one was very practical, that if our target is 50%, and then if we focus on urban areas, then at the time we estimate this will cost about 8 billion to do this for a country to achieve that target. If we want to do it equitably and include all areas that have that level of service, it's 16 billion. And I'm absolutely fine with either. That's a political choice. Give us a steer. In terms of probably a qualification on rural, what we generally mean is extra urban. So 2 miles from a thing, the rail station to the town, and they are often perfectly applicable for cycling and walking to be a viable mode to connect in and to get to those resources. But the cost of providing the safe space doesn't vary a great deal. So that if you've got 10 people using it or 10,000, the cost is the same, and that's the challenge that we face.
And then obviously there's very different physical geography in different places. I mean, it's flat in East Anglia, it's hilly in the West Country. Does that have a big impact upon the interventions that you think need to be taken?
I think the propensity for each mode will change depending on the geography to some degree. So I went with the previous Secretary of State to her area of Sheffield, very hilly. So there's much more of an emphasis on bus, public transport and e-bike provision. So a local bike scheme we put in and e-bikes, which are becoming incredibly popular. The committee might want to touch on that particular topic at some point. So yes, I think that's where the local area has to drive what's needed based on their geography. Just one tiny additional point to the rural aspect. We tend to really avoid shared use because it just creates a conflict. So shared use space for cycling and walking. But once you get your usage goes down quite dramatically in a rural setting, that might be quite applicable. Cost-effective way to provide a safe space for either of those modes because the interaction is much reduced.
And then just finally, presumably across the country there are a lot of sort of similarities. I'm thinking in my constituency we've got a canal towpath, which it's the Grand Union Canal, it goes all the way up the country. To what extent do you kind of look to see how walking and cycling has worked in one place like that, particularly when it's a piece of infrastructure that stretches along a long way, and therefore through various different councils and funding bodies?
That was my opening position, or rather Andy Burnham's opening position when I worked with him, when certainly the central city, Manchester, and it connects out, has a canal network in place. This is space that's already there. Can we use it? And then you bump into lots of restrictions. Essentially, if you want to change this from being a nice place to connect with nature, to go for a jog or to fish, that small space has to get bigger. And the only way to get bigger is to go out over the water. And then you bump into people who want to keep it the same, and quite rightly so. The Canals and Rivers Trust, we had to deal with Peel Holdings, who owned the land, where the biggest issue was narrow bridges. That what do you do? And you have to choose, am I going to use this for a boat or for people? And importantly, it's often a way. We've built up our cities with our backs to the canals, so they're often spaces that you would not go there when it's dark. You wouldn't be comfortable with your kids walking home without going that. So we realised there were so many barriers. Its potential is there to use it as a network, but once you go past a very small amount, it starts to create issues. So in London you use quite a lot of the canals for that very reason, but there's a lot of conflict because you've got a big speed difference between two sets of people. So I would agree with you, I would take that on, but it's a different set of battles with a different set of people.
Rebecca.
Hello, I'm a bit late, apologies for that.
That's the best bit at the start as well.
Sorry. Just following on from Alex's question, particularly on the kind of urban fringe and the boundary issue, how do you actively seek to work where there's sort of a changing responsibility? So I'm thinking of one brilliant example where one local authority has a brilliantly laid cycle path that becomes the responsibility of the other and it turns into a mud track on the way into a city, so you can work out which of the two organisations cares more, and also how do you help, particularly in rural areas, plug the gaps? Because I'm down in the southwest where we do have that hilly issue, and so often they seem to piece everything up, slice it up into small bits, and then you get the local campaigners coming and saying we can't go from A to B still because this little chunk here has never been finished. How actively are you as Active Travel working with local authorities to tackle those specific gaps? Because I think if you can do that, you win a whole load of plaudits, both cyclists and pedestrians, because we had a cycle path that ended in a flight of stairs based in the funding that was available at the time. Well, clearly that's not a great look for the local authority at the time.
No. I'll start and you might want to build on this, but that again was a very live issue for me in Greater Manchester when I started to work with 10 authorities. So the bedrock at the start was to help them create very quickly a network plan, which they then put to the public, and that went from 1,000 miles to 1,800 miles because of that public consultation. The biggest complaint online was where's our bit, which gave political consensus to do something that crossed boundaries. Then where we ran into a lot of challenges on delivery is we had 10 different highways authorities with different motivations. And in some cases it was ludicrously one side of the road versus the other side of the road. And that's a real challenge. It is the opportunity for combined authorities to start to have combined plans. I think there's something to be considered nationally about requiring the provision of a consistent level of service no matter where you are in the country, as we do for driving. And I think that, I'm sorry to thrash the phrase, it's above my pay grade, but it is a really live issue, and it speaks to efficiency. It speaks to costs that we're having to do things multiple times and mesh with those different political motivations. And I think there's a real potential there to speed up delivery and reduce costs by getting that consistent guidance, which is something I would support if that was brought forward. I'm not sure whether that entirely answers your question. I think in a smaller scale, Active Travel England can help plug those gaps in. In fact, you've done some work identifying areas where.
Can I just come back? I mean, I think just in response to that, one of the challenges you've got is, and we've had this when we were talking about railway last week, is we've got the big combined authorities already, but the vast majority of the council doesn't have those. And so as a local politician, I've brought officers together to talk to each other across 3 councils because they weren't. But I think what they're finding is that then accessing things together are potentially the challenge. And when you are dealing with a 250,000 city and district councils, that's completely different to the power that Greater Manchester has to go in and sort of leverage its position. So I don't know what impact that would have.
I mentioned earlier, we have regional managers who are based out within each of the regions, and so one of their jobs is to try to engage with everybody and bring them to the table. If the scheme that you're referring to, it ends in a flight of stairs, I think that is one of the schemes that we're funding through Active Travel Fund 4 to the tune of £2.1 million to make sure that we get rid of that barrier.
And I knew that was happening.
That's pretty good detailed knowledge there. A set of stairs.
But that's exactly what we would do, is to try to make sure that I think one of the things that I would say pretty confidently in terms of the team and the investment team that we've got, if something came to us that was looking at a scheme and it only looked like it was point here to point here and it didn't take into account the junctions at the end or the other issues that you referred to, we would refuse it on that basis. And we've refused lots of funding bids in the past few years on that basis because they don't take into account a coherence of a network. And then, as I kind of pointed out here, that one of the things that we would try to do is instead route the funding towards things that actually plug those gaps as well.
Just an additional point, our regional team has had, in less than 2 years, 2,600 engagements with local officers to try and address that and get the consistency. And we've trained over 1,000 local authority officers in bespoke design, planning and that. So we're starting to address that connectivity piece.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you, and thanks for what you've offered us so far. I totally support what Ollie said. It's very refreshing, but I'm also left feeling insanely frustrated about the last few decades of failure, basically, and this country in general inability, it seems, to think strategically, particularly when it comes to rural areas that have been described. I will save my rant about that for later on when we come to talk about integrated transport. I actually wanted to ask you about 2 other dimensions. We've looked at things to the dimension of mode or urban-rural or mobility. Professional transport, as in people who are travelling for work, not to work, but for work. I'm visiting an e-bike in Wells next to the sea shortly, not because it's the first horseless box we've had in North Norfolk, but because it's being used by a first responder and paramedic. Have you looked at how transport in the course of carrying out work could be made more active? And also another dimension, which would be economics. I think Sustrans published a report recently that suggested that lower economic groups and lower paid workers were getting excluded from cycle to work schemes. Are you aware of this and have any views on this as well?
Right, so the cycle to work scheme, I'm glad you touched on that. I think it's a great scheme, and I don't think we've achieved its potential yet, that ability to remove the barrier to access to what is then almost a virtually cost-free form of transport that can cover significant distance. So access to work, it's huge. But as you've just alluded to at the moment, it excludes about 2 million people are priced out because they don't have access to the self-employed, quite a large group. And I'm aware of Sustrans bringing that report forward last year. I think they were recommending something like a 40% discount that could, I think it was going to cost about 18 million to extend the scheme to cover more people. and they estimated that it realised about 60 million in benefits. So fiscally constrained times, as we know, but I think it fits with the ethos of the government and wanted to make sure that people don't get left behind, have access to work. I think this is a very, I think it's a very attractive tool to use and really support government if they wanted to explore it further. But it is a tax scheme as opposed to an intervention.
Bike, yeah, that's right. And on the issue of possibly using active travel in order to carry out work.
Sorry, yes. It's not something it's in our remit, but once you make safe space, and it's particularly in dense urban areas, and you see it obviously a lot in London, then it's a really efficient tool and it's used across the world. We would support it. I'm not sure we have a direct role in choosing or encouraging people to use it in a particular way. If you like, we create the landscape, and that's the kind of thing that could happen on it. It's a very wide answer.
I think I'd also just add that the size of the agency is only 90 people. Yeah. And we have to prioritise the work that we do, and so we're focusing on the things that we feel that add the most value for our core customers at the moment, but within the context of what you just said and what Catherine brought up earlier.
Relevant to me as Commissioner.
It's the kind of thing that we could seek to extend into, but we focused on making sure that we could do our basics right and improve things to start with.
Would it be fair to say that if the infrastructure was there and the safe routes were there, that actually there's a commercial imperative for employers to encourage, I don't know, if you've got a fleet of people cleaning public toilets, for example, to go to bike rather than van, that would just happen as a natural extension of having the operations and the infrastructure there?
Could do. That would be strengthened by procurement regulations or decisions that people take through procurement as well, and making maximum use of things like the Social Value Act as well. You know, if you've got a big agency that has a significant procurement opportunity, they can really help that as well.
There's parcel delivery, I think, is a big part of this same grouping, if you like, and I know that in London, Amazon in particular, are using an awful lot of cargo bikes because it's a more efficient way. It's actually more cost effective to move things around. They're now trialling successfully in Manchester, so the potential for micro mobility to become part of the mix is high.
Thank you. You just touched on targets and funding and your specific roles, and that takes on to targets and funding. So, Lawrence.
Thank you. Are you still working to the targets as set by the second cycling and walking investment strategy?
We have not been instructed to do otherwise. 50% is still the target that we have and that we are working towards. I think it's reasonable to say that the time frame and the political priority changes and funding that changed, so we had our budget cut by 2/3 a couple of years ago, have certainly make it more and more challenging as that time scale goes down, but we are still working to that 50% as a goal at the moment.
And that document sets a short-term target to increase the percentage of short journeys in towns and cities undertaken by active travel to 46% by 2025. What is the current or latest figure?
We were ahead on walking. That has slipped back. Graham.
Yeah, we were ahead. We'd met it. We're below it at the moment, and I think one of the things to note though is that the total number of walking and cycling trips is relatively static at the moment, but the total number of overall trips has increased. So as a mode share, walking and cycling has gone down, despite the fact that it's stayed as a number reasonably consistent. The other thing to note as well is obviously, you know, we've been in existence for 2 years now, so we're hoping to see the benefits of the stats that we gave earlier about high quality infrastructure design and delivery and so on. That will take longer to feed into the statistics that we're seeing at the moment, because we're only looking at 2023 stats.
We will get clarity on government's ambition this year with the new Cycle and Walking Investment Strategy 3, which is due this year, with a report to Parliament in March, I think. So we're already starting to work on that, where we'll get clarity on what is the new ambition of this government, and obviously the spending review, the resources available.
Thank you. And Chris, you said earlier that the 50% target was challenging. To push you a little bit further on that, is it still feasible?
Well, the reason I hesitate to just give you a yes or no answer is it depends on how much money you want to throw at it, and it depends on how highly you want to prioritise this over everything. So, to be dramatic again, if you turned off traffic as effectively we did during COVID, then you're there. You get it. But that's obviously way too extreme a solution to be palatable. So it depends on what resource and prioritisation the government want to put on it. It is extremely challenging without significant change.
And I'll come back to funding, Chair, but just to pick up Graham's point on these statistics, according to the National Travel Survey, compared to 10 years ago, the number of walking journeys per head has increased, but the number of cycling journeys per head has fallen. And you may feel that this question's been answered because you talked about some of the changes in attitude towards cycling, but to ask the direct question, why do you think we have seen those two different measures for walking compared to cycling?
If I might just do a headline there, I think there's a caveat to that. Where infrastructure has been made consistently, been made available, then cycling is increasing. So London has had a 10-year commitment to infrastructure, had consistent funding and consistent policy, and it is seeing year-on-year increase every year. The rest of the country has not had its year-to-year funding, so the local areas cannot employ officers. So they cannot design large-scale because they don't know what's coming the year after. So more important than resource, that consistency is what we need to get back into the system so everybody can trust that it's there, and we will plan and build accordingly. Where it has been, so you've got Waltham Forest, you've got one of the schools I visited last year, Kesgrave, just outside Ipswich, 63% of kids ride there every day. And I thought that was a mistake because that's more than Holland. It's 800 to 900 kids because they have that space. So, but when you zoom out for a whole country, that change is happening in small places at the moment, but we haven't got that large-scale commitment, so we haven't got large-scale change.
I'd note and compare it with almost 9 billion more miles being driven as well within the same period. One thing that I don't have the statistics on, but I think is an interesting thing to think on, is also the implications of when somebody gets themselves a car, you have to be earning a pretty significant amount of money to be able to afford to own a car, insure a car, and then decide not to use it as well. So one of the things I think that we need to think about is access as opposed to ownership. We've seen a lot of industries in this country change model away from kind of ownership and where you access things, and people do that a lot with leisure time all the time now, but we haven't necessarily moved to that within the context of certain mobility choices. And as I say, coming from a metropolitan area in the northeast, you've got to have a reasonable amount of money to be able to afford a car and then decide not to use it, and not everybody does, and that will influence the choices that people take.
Can I add one data gathering point which the committee might be interested in? That we've realised that where we are measuring cycle levels at the moment, the cameras, the systems that we're using are very often in places where you wouldn't want to do it. So on major roads. So that observation has now been made, and it needs to be translated to looking in the right place. So I think that's an extraordinary thing that we need to change, how we actually gather the data.
The question is about walking and cycling coming to the National Travel Survey.
So National Travel Survey, I think the most recent one was about 14,000 returns. It looks at 2023 data as opposed to 2024, and so I think that the point was that walking has increased and cycling has come down over the 10 years. So the National Travel Survey is a great piece of work, and
so that's a key data point for you. Yeah. And in order to achieve the 50% of journeys by walking and cycling, what changes would be needed to make that achievable? That aren't already in place.
There's a menu. So, lowering speed limits and enforcing speed limits would be very effective. So that is one tool that could be used. There's changes to streetscapes that could be used, but it is about, in essence, it is making safe space where people feel safe and then activate, giving them a reason to try different. So the behaviour change tools are really helpful if used in the right way to get people to try travelling differently. So the £2 bus fare, for example, just it made it talked about, and people went, oh, I'll try that. To go slightly sideways, but I think it's very relevant. In France, there were some regional schemes to actually get people to try travelling actively, and particularly and things like uptake of e-bikes, and they found time limiting made a big difference as well. Actually, time limiting, although it wasn't a case of, oh, that's quite interesting, I'll carry on. Oh, that finishes on Thursday, I'll go and try it. So there's a suite of measures, but it comes down to safety.
That was useful. Scott?
Thanks, and I'm glad you mentioned speed limits. Really important, actually. I think it's time we have a serious conversation about that. So do you have the right targets, though? You started off talking about the importance of people driving less and walking and cycling more for their health, but shifting people out of cars onto bikes and walking isn't one of your targets explicitly, is it?
Sorry, I can't quite hear the question. I'm a little...
Do you have the right targets? If your focus is people driving less and walking and cycling more, that's not actually one of your targets, is it?
To get people to drive less?
No, to get them out of their cars and walk and cycle more. That's not a target, is it?
I suppose our focus is to increase one thing, which will automatically decrease the other. So there was actually somewhere buried in here, there's a statistic on what would, if we get that shift, what would be the impact on congestion, to actually reducing congestion, because we've got people to move. So I think it might be just a question of how it's described. And I think it's really important that we're not stopping that, we're making something else as attractive, or giving you a reason to travel in a different way that benefits our communities. And that choice thing, this is the way it's been polarised in the media. It's been framed as stopping me doing the things I want, when in essence we've been stopped having more choice because we have saturated with one mode. So it's a really important piece of framing to make sure that people understand that this is about increasing transport choice, which is actually something I connected very well with Mark Harper, my previous Secretary of State.
Yeah, but people want the freedom to be stuck in traffic jams in their car. That's the challenge. But I do worry that some of the growth in walking and cycling might come people just switching from public transport onto cycling, rather than moving from cars, and I think that would be a concern. In terms of your targets, in our briefing, that it's relatively high level. Do you break them down into gender and ethnic minorities, etc., to see where there's growing and where there's opportunities, and geography as well? Because I know in Edinburgh we recognise gender as being an issue, so we've got a fantastic group called Infrasisters, which encourages women to cycle, safe cycling in the evenings, that kind of thing. So do you break the data down to that kind of level? And do you have kind of sub-targets?
Not at the moment. And I think it comes back to the point in terms of the development of the cycling walking investment strategy. They're exactly the kinds of questions that colleagues at DFT are asking themselves based on guidance from ministers around what they might want to see.
There's some intersectionality. I don't often use big words, but that if we target areas of most need, so really bigger health problems, there is that intersectionality of communities, ethnicity, and obviously financial positions, that you probably hit a lot of that if you target your resource in areas that need it most. To boil it down to a simple phrase, you will probably get there anyway. But with transport, I think it's making it easy for everybody, and then everybody uses it.
Well, I do think you have to target a little bit, because I think people from deprived communities stand to benefit the most, as a generalisation, from more walking and cycling. So I do think we have to target a little bit through things like bike hire schemes, etc., giving them easier access. I think that's a possibility. The cycling, walking, the third version of that, the infrastructure plan. When you described the targets earlier, it wasn't clear to me if the government's setting the targets, or you guys are setting the targets, or is it a discussion? Are they handed down in tablets of stone to you, or do you hand them up on tablets of stone?
I think if I can, this is all very live at the moment, so devolution is a really strong agenda with a lot of potential, and give areas control, and I have experience of that. I think one of the success stories when Greater Manchester started the journey was we gave people the pen, almost figuratively and literally gave them the pen, and also the choice to do nothing. But I'm going to make what nothing means, those consequences, you're going to own that as well. And the regions changed and chose to change. So right now, the relationship with regions is very, very good. It's good with us, it's good with government. They have told us, as we mentioned earlier, that we want to produce 15 to 20,000 miles of safe space to enable the school run local shops to be done actively, cycling, walking, if people choose. And so that is it's a national mission being designed locally. And I think that's a really exciting proposition because people want the same outcomes for their communities. But if it's locally driven, it's much more likely to stick. And then national government can then empower and aid local government to deliver that. And I think that's the kind of discussion we're part of at the moment. And I think that's got real potential.
The department sets the targets. They are talking to us about what's deliverable, clearly, because, I mean, within the context of whenever you're designing or delivering something, from the perspective of somebody who used to have to deliver civil engineering schemes, if you set somebody a target that isn't achievable, what is the point of the target? And so ultimately what DFT are doing at the moment is making sure that they're discussing with us and regions and others what is deliverable within the context of different scenarios, and the targets will have to flow from there. And
their target of increasing public transport use is explicitly going to help you, isn't it? I mean, that won't cost you any money, but it's really going to help you.
And it's about whether or not those targets sit alongside each other. Because
they're underfunded as well, yeah.
I hope when that discussion has taken place, the clarity is visible in outcome frameworks for devolution deals. I think that's really important, that areas are allowed to, you choose, you understand how to do it, but we've agreed that this is what you are going to achieve. I would be very supportive of that approach.
I get just one tiny one. A thing that's come up quite a few times is the increase in use of car, the vehicle kilometres, that's rising. You've made that point a few times. In Scotland, we have a target of reducing the vehicle kilometres by 20% by 2030. It's unfunded, there's no real strategy to deliver, but the target is there's an aspiration. Do you think the government should do something like that? And because that would be a big boost to your agenda, wouldn't it?
I think that there's an existing Act of Parliament that hasn't been enacted. That I think it's called the Road Traffic Reduction Strategy or something along that side. It's from many years ago.
I'd be much more in favour, and these aren't decisions for us, so it's very much an opinion and what we would support, but I'd be very much in favour of increasing choice to making other things more attractive, or at least as attractive. And that tallies with people have told us, 80% of people saying we want this, and then that will happen as a result. But I think we need to reduce car use and focus on it. We actually have to drive, if we want to meet our decarbonisation strategy, regional figures I used to see, and it seems to be consistent, we have to drive about a quarter less. But the only equitable way to make that happen is to give people a viable and attractive alternative, and that's our focus.
If I may, the macro target is really useful, but it is the point that you made earlier, Chair. Geography and local circumstances play into this so much, and so they're the conversations we're having around seawards. You did mention the point around deprivation, so I did just want to note that more than 50% of the capital funding that we've provided has been invested in routes that pass through areas in the highest IMD quintile for deprivation and where health outcomes are generally lowest. Only 6% of our investment has been targeted at the lowest quintile in terms of deprivation.
Lawrence, back to funding.
Returning to funding, we heard a short while ago that the greatest barrier to achieving the 50% target is resourcing. I mean, what is the gap in terms of your current budget? If I've captured that
I'll just correct that slightly. I think we said we agreed it was safe space, and we talked about there were several different ways that you can achieve that. So you can reduce speeds, you could restrict traffic from particular areas to make them feel safe, you can make lanes, so there's lots of different ways you can do it. So there's an international example of the city of Ghent, who only had €6 million, and they spent 2 years consulting, and then in one weekend they changed the circulation pattern for the whole area and achieved incredible results, which sadly I can't immediately recall, but there were dramatic changes that were really welcomed after the fact. for €6 million. So it depends the levers of difficult, expensive routes to do it. So resource-wise, I don't think the costs will have changed dramatically in the road context that we have from the previous session that we had 2 years ago.
I see. So one thing perhaps that has changed is the budget cuts which you spoke about, and I did know in your last annual report it said that operating expenditure have fallen from 258 million in 22-23 to 146 million, most of that funding reduction coming from the local authority grants. What was the practical effects of those grant reductions? Our original budget gave us the ability to help be a strong part of the conversation because people want access to cash, and we, with the capability ratings, and I can't stress the impact of that, meant that we funded things that worked and got delivered really quickly, and that's worked. So less cash, there's less of that we can do. So now we're moving to much more devolved settlements of transport for an area, you choose how you spend it. The outcome framework is going to be a really important aspect, in my belief, of how you make sure that you get the impacts that you want. Now, we have been consulted and inputted into that conversation what should be in output frameworks, but it's not in our gift to choose how to do it. So we're adapting really quickly to a different funding landscape. I don't think it's necessarily more money. I think it's choosing how what is already out there, how it's spent, or rather defining very clearly what it must achieve. And the outcome is the most important thing, what it must achieve, and let regions do it. And they'll gravitate towards a lot of the same methodology because there's a lot of commonality, and I think that's key. But consistency is more important than the quantum. The fact that it is here and it stays here and you can depend this will be a priority for a decade or more, then local authorities can build capacity and gear up to do that, which is exactly what London did, who's the only place in the country that's had multi-year funding. I think, I won't speak for others, but I think we do understand the importance of long-term certainty in funding, but just returning to those in-year budget reductions for 23-24, is it accurate to boil it down to say that those projects not proceeding meant that fewer people are now cycling and that 50% target is harder to hit?
Yes, it's made it extremely hard to hit those targets, and there'd have to be some quite significant changes in terms of policy or funding to be able to meet it by 2030. But we still have a massive pipeline of schemes with local authorities. They still have their network plans. We've just slowed right down on the delivery without the commitment to deliver it. Commitment in terms of consistency and the funding itself.
And just final questions. I'm conscious that colleagues may want to come in on this topic. In terms of your role as a statutory consultee, how stretched are you in terms of all the planning applications and other topics you may be asked to take a view on?
Well, the team of caseworkers that we have in the planning team is only 9 people, which compares to National Highways 50 or more, and we don't have a consultancy spend associated with it either. Despite that, in the first year of operation, our team responded to 99% of planning consultations within statutory timescales. The thing that I would note about the approach that we took to the planning system, and where we were given a role in development management such to the point that the proposals that people are coming forward with are very much set in terms of this is what we're coming forward with. As such, if we'd entered into the system and tried to say you need to redo absolutely everything, you would have lost all credibility with the development industry, because they would be saying, we've been working on this for 3 years and you've literally just turned up and are telling us to do it differently. So there has been an element of building both credibility with the development industry and with local authorities, making small adjustments, making sure that things like cycle parking is actually in appropriate locations or even included at all. Those kind of things that actually just play to what the development industry have been saying that this is what they want to achieve anyway. So we've done what we can within the context of where we're at. We did a 1-year review of our performance in the planning system, which was independently done by a planning consultancy called Litchfields. That's made recommendations both about our current performance, but also about the extension of our role into pre-application, which is a much better place within the planning system for us to be able to work with developers to deliver the right things. That's been supported by those who took part in the 1-year review. And so we've been stretched, certainly in terms of the resource. We don't have the same amount of resource as some of the other statutory consultees in the system, but despite that, we've responded on time to more than 99% of our consultations.
Sorry, Ollie wanted to come in. Yeah.
Yes, just a quick supplementary on funding. Very much agree with what you said about need for consistency and long term. But can I push you just a little bit more on what you said about the amount not being important or not being the main thing? Ahead of the autumn budget, 18 organisations, including the Association of Directors of Public Health, Cycling UK and the Ramblers, to give some examples, called for 10% of the transport budget to go on walking and cycling compared to the current 2% in England. Do you think that's a reasonable call, and would you support it?
Well, it's 10% of an unknown figure at the moment. So I said last time we were here that it would cost over a period of time 8 billion to actually address it in a focused way. So doing the majority of your work in densely populated urban areas, I think that still roughly holds true. I think where we've avoided talking about the actual quantum is there is money in the system. It is regional. It is for integrated transport and providing more choice for people. I think the money is there. It's more a case of how it is spent. So to a degree, when you say 8% of budget, but that budget is now devolved, so those regions will have to agree what their priority is. So some people already have what they need, mainly to spend less and more on trams and buses and trains to actually connect, whereas other areas don't have that big infrastructure, and that's where the majority should go. So there needs to be some balancing, I think, through throughout the system, regionally driven and negotiated.
Okay. Very quickly. Yeah.
So just to return to planning, earlier you were talking about how you were training up staff in local authorities. So 2 parts of this question. Does that include planners? I'm sure it does. And as well as commenting on planning applications, are you also trying to inform the development planning policy both nationally and within local authorities? Because stronger planning policy would mean you would be less need for you to intervene in theory.
So to your latter point, what we have done is we did a pilot project on local plans to determine how strong different local plans were and what approaches could be taken to a new round of local planning to ensure that active travel was embedded. We've produced a guidance document that we provided to local authorities on that. But that is the point. That is where we feel that we would add the most benefit in terms of supporting the planning system and supporting the ambitions in terms of housing and growth and so on, is to get in at that earliest location. That's not just our view, that is the view of the development industry who we've talked to a lot about this. One of the other points that they often make is the point about consistency, not necessarily on funding, but of expectation in terms of standards of highway design as well, whereby that can often, because of the fact that local highways authorities are responsible for what they determine to be adoptable standards, they can vary from one side of the road to another, and that's not as efficient as it could be for the development industry. But yeah, so we focused on where we were given a task, and we focused on delivering it to the best of our ability, while also making the case for how that task could extend in scope or change in focus to deliver better outcomes.
Training for planners, you have the capacity to do that? Or
well, we have done that. So before we started, we went around the country, we did 10 road shows, and we invited members of planning from every single local authority in the country so we could introduce them to what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, and then we followed it up about 9 months to 12 months later across the country again to make sure that we were providing training in the latest toolkit that we did. Our original toolkit that we released had 32 different criteria. It was incredibly thorough. but it wasn't as pragmatic or practical as it could have been for local authorities. So listening to their feedback and the feedback of the development industry, we made changes within a year, reissued our toolkit, and it's now being used up and down the country. That only has 10 criteria now, and we've trained them in how to use it.
When we're talking about planning, you don't just mean town planners. Does this include the engineering and the on the ground scheme design? Yeah. Okay.
What we've been trying to do.
And are there sufficient skills in that? And I know there was a lot of skills development when Cycling England was around for the 5 years until it was abolished in 2010. To the extent some of that skill set disappeared. But it was nevertheless, there was nevertheless quite a strong body of knowledge among on cycle design. But is that also there for when because now, unlike Cycling England, your role is cycling, wheeling, and walking. Is there the similar level of skills on the highway design? For those other two areas?
Trying to choose words carefully because it's the entire industry and all the people who we work with. I think one of the things that has happened is that you get generational differences as well as different industries move through it. A lot of people working within this industry want to see the same outcomes. Yeah. They want to deliver integrated transport that is accessible, inclusive, and that is designed to the best of their abilities. There's very few that don't, that I've encountered, working 15 years in the industry. What we have been doing is trying to make sure that we train people. So we've seen a rise from 8 to 38 local authority-led training programs from what we've been doing. 7,500 people in authorities have been trained through our webinars and roadshows. More than 1,000 local authorities have received bespoke design and planning training, and we've done 10 guidance notes and toolkits. That said, we want to do more. And so back to the point about the corporate plan, one of the things that we have been working on is a 3-year training and education programme, which, subject to budget and resource requirements, we would love to take forward in the next 3 years as to how to make sure that we are taking the best of what people do across the country and enabling everybody else to do it as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Rebecca.
Hi, just on the back of what you said about the percentage of funding you have compared to Highways England, just a thought, which is an additional question, Chair, sorry, but while it's there, do you think there would be a value on an equivalent of national highways for cycling, so that there was almost an equal footing?
I think that...
Don't look at me.
I think, look, well, active travelling, to a degree, the way that the industry has responded is Active Travel England is that. It's not the size and scale of national highways. We've only got 90 people in comparison to the many thousands that would work within national highways.
And we've essentially piloted. We've had a 2-year set up a new agency with a new way of working. And this is a very welcome opportunity which forced us to go, and what's it done? Did it work? And I think you've heard today the results are quite remarkable. And we know what more we could do now. And so going down into pre-application work is what everybody in the planning building industry want. They want to know in advance how to pass the homework question. So we want to do more of that. In terms of quantum, from what we've learned, that's will be laid out, the government's ambition in CWIS 3 and through the spending review. But we know that there's the potential to do more is huge.
There's one other core difference, I think, which is that national highways have an asset that they own on behalf of the country. They manage, they maintain it, and they improve it. And therefore, that's what they do. Whereas to a degree, one of the things that we do slightly differently is we don't have the same asset in that the National Cycle Network isn't part of ATE. We more act to convene local highway authority practitioners who have their responsibility for their network, which is 98% of the highway network in England is local authority and 2% is national highways. So our role isn't necessarily to be exactly the same as national highways, it's to operate slightly differently by making sure that we can convene and coordinate and help local authorities deliver the best things that they possibly can.
Great. Which then leads me really well into the question I was supposed to ask, sorry.
No, don't worry.
How have capability ratings for local authorities influenced ATE's decision making, and what are you doing to assist local authorities with low ratings?
I missed the first part of that.
Sorry, how have capability ratings for local authorities influenced your decision making?
They've influenced our decision making dramatically. It was a system born out of working in local authorities. It was seen as a very bold thing to do, to introduce that system. It essentially rates everybody. But very quickly the trust was there, was we want to help you deliver things that you can win at, and we will help you get better. So it's influenced our decision making, it's driven all of our decision making. And I think if you look at how much delivery has been speeded up and the quality of schemes, we have the evidence that it's very, very clearly works. And I think it's a new culture for local authorities to understand. It also helps local politicians drive their organisations to produce quality. So having that evidence base now to show doing it this way and you'll deliver twice as fast and you'll win and you'll get better at it has been welcomed, and hence it's being considered now more widely for wider transport, taking the same approach. Indeed, I think, I don't mind saying I'm considering it, working with DCMS for an approach for a wholly different sphere. That matching of capability and training is the way to go.
And then where you have got local authorities who have those lower ratings, what do you do specifically to help them improve that?
We speak to them in the first instance. We speak to them about what their problems are, and those problems might be different dependent on the political or the practitioner level, and then we develop a tailored programme of support for them and go in and deliver that. So I think we had 9 authorities that were considered capability rated 0. After a year, and we'd gone in and done work, 8 authorities moved up in the capability ratings and only 1 moved down last year. So yeah, we develop tailored programs of work, and we make sure that we take out planners, designers and so on, and help deliver training and support them with the development of their package of schemes and things like that.
It's also up to them. That's really important, the local ownership. If you don't want to do this, that's up to you. But we make it visible that is a choice, which helps. And then local decisions are based on that. I think that visibility is really important.
The practitioners that we work with have said that they're incredibly important in terms of people want to aspire not only to not be seen at lower in the ratings, but also to get up into the realms of, we want to be at 3, we want to be seen on the same level as Transport for Greater Manchester, West Midlands. And
it's healthy competition as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
And what is your role in ensuring that individual local authorities are taking opportunities to develop and deliver sufficient schemes to increase active travel in their areas? I suppose you can flip it on their head. How can they best get what they need to do what they want to deliver in their local area through you?
Again, it depends on the area, and it does depend on the area. One of the things that there is some concern about is that with the move towards devolution, that some of the smaller schemes might be left behind. And so one of the things that we're doing is working with those areas to make sure that we identify where they think that there might be barriers or issues, and producing things that work for them. So for example, one of the things that we talk about is that within the context of devolution, in any combined authority area, they will be bidding for money. And so our perspective would be, well, why don't we help you create one business case that illustrates the value of the types of local measures that you're talking about that you can all use, as opposed to each of you individually commissioning consultants or others to do the same work across various different geographies. So we try to find ways to help them with making the case efficiently as well.
What will happen before devolution happens? Because obviously, again, we had this conversation last week, it could be 3 or 4 years before these CLAs exist in certain areas. Do people just sort of carry on regardless and carry on as if nothing's changed until it changes, as far as what they're doing with you is concerned?
So there's a transition period, clearly, both in terms, and the funding that we allocate and dedicate, what we will do is the same thing that we have been doing previously, which is looking at the quality of the designs that they bring in and not funding anything that doesn't meet the kind of criteria, the quality criteria. And then for others areas, what we tend to do is, as they move through that transition, we will step in with different things. So for example, with established combined authority areas, we have things called design review panels, where we meet with them and go through both their pipeline of programme and the schemes or issues that they've got on the ground with our designers to help them unpick issues. And then what we already have is kind of a 2-year programme looking forward, understanding when different authorities might be coming on, and therefore when we would have to resource up to make sure that we can fulfil the same kind of support with them that was being developed in-house by one of our principal engineers.
If you want a good example, I'd be very welcome you to my constituency, because we've been working on this for years, trying to get everyone joining up, and I think we've got some good examples of what needs to change and what's worked well. So.
No, that's a useful offer, Rebecca. Thank you. Alex.
Sticking on the devolution theme, I think generically we'd all be interested in what impact you think the additional devolution is going to potentially have on cycling and walking. I'm also conscious that you have alluded to the fact that highways and local transport powers are split when you've got an MCA at the moment, with them residing still in the local councils. Has that you also appear to say to some extent that had been a bit of a barrier, which is why in Greater Manchester you came up with the capability ratings. It strikes me that with the local government reorganisation, the move to more strategic authorities, there's going to be further areas which are at the moment either county councils or unitary authorities where those powers are going to be split up again. Do you have any views from your experience of working in an MCA as to whether that is a barrier? And you've also alluded as well to Transport for Greater Manchester. So the concept of having a passenger transport executive or equivalent, that is at the moment only in very sort of certain parts of the country, and there are others that don't have them. So that concept of the way that local government is changing, how do you think that those structural changes are going to impact upon the work that you do?
There's a lot of potential and pitfalls built into it. What I like about the relationship with national and local government is local empowerment. But I think what we need to make sure it goes out is local accountability. So if you're going to be, and the potential is to address some of what happens on one side of the road, the other side of the road issues that we've discussed today, is, and they're big cultural changes in local areas, is why do you need 10 different authorities? Because my journey doesn't stop when I get to the edge of this particular authority. I think they're going to be quite difficult conversations, but the efficiency potential there in terms of pace and cost saving is huge. And they are not in our remit to work out. I think we have set up to be very adaptable to work within the confines that we've got. Devolution, I think, brings with it a lot of change and there's quite a few risks in there. And I think we're right in the middle of working through that now in the white papers going back and forth.
Two points I'd like to bring out, if I may, is that within the devolution white paper, it notes the fact that mayors can ask ATE to undertake a capability rating of their constituent authorities, which is an interesting approach, which hasn't, at the moment, the capability rating applies to the entire area as opposed to constituent areas of it. And the white paper explicitly makes reference to the fact that mayors can do that so that they can understand their own patch in terms of delivery. The other thing that it notes is that while local highway standards will remain with local authorities, that mayors are encouraged or enabled to look to align them, which could help with the consistency point of design standards that I was referencing earlier.
Sorry, Graham, if I might, there's a wider efficiency that could be considered here. There's an awful lot of local authorities producing their own guidance, when we could have more explicit or an agreement or direction to use a national guidance, so there's a consistent level of service for the public wherever you are in the country. And I think local authorities might welcome that. But we see an awful lot of guidance, and it often contains the same stuff for people trying to create some consistency. But a picture, I think, could be taken bigger. I think welcome that.
And obviously with this changed landscape, presumably you're working through how you as an organisation are going to have to work differently. Have you thought about whether you might need any additional resources, additional powers? Maybe you need fewer, I don't know. What's your thinking on that at the moment?
Looking at so we touched on a few things like very, very simple measures like side road zebra crossing markings, the things that would be really helpful. But we also have a lot of powers that we aren't using fully yet. And I think There's a lot can be done with what we've got if we use it more effectively. Within the system. I think more regulation and powers takes time, and it's not always the answer. I think, well, what have we got that if we dialed that up properly? The very obvious one and simple one is controlling speed, which we know is a major cause of danger and a major cause of people feeling unsafe. So controlling speed effectively would be, have a massive impact without changing any powers.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to wider policy influence. Ollie.
What influence has Active Travel England had on the current changes being proposed to the National Planning Policy Framework?
Well, again, I would reflect that it's the Department for Transport that's responsible for policy, so most of the engagement will have taken place between Department for Transport and MHCLG. That said, in line with what we talked about in terms of the cycling, walking in investment strategy, our colleagues at DFT did consult and confer with us as to what would help aid us in terms of delivery and so on. I think so. The work that has taken place in the wording changes towards vision-led planning can't be underestimated, and they lead towards a different way of doing things potentially. One of the things that is interesting and really important now is the framework within which local authorities and the development industry can move forward with certainty as to how to go about applying that. And for people who aren't as au fait with it, I think it's the idea that instead of relying on a computer software package that tells you that this many vehicle trips will be created by this many homes, it's saying if we build it in this way, it will deliver that many, but if we build it in this way, perhaps built around active travel and public transport integration, that it will create reduced levels of car trips, which will reduce the impact on surrounding junctions, reduce the costs associated with changing junctions, and so on and so forth. So we engage with through Department for Transport with MHCLG on this. I think that the really important thing that we're thinking about and how we help deliver support in terms of the training and education package to local authorities in the industry as to take what is in the NPPF and be like, right, this is how it could work in practice. That's the thing that we really want to focus on.
There's real potential there, just to home in on something that Graham said, that we assume that planning and anybody who's involved in that system and as a statutory consultee is a potential blocker, and is it something that we should remove? There's also potential here to, if you genuinely create an attractive alternative to driving, so you have an integrated transport offer, and you know it will be there and you build accordingly, then you don't have to build that big junction. So there's there's huge cost save that could be spent somewhere else, or just save, and you speed up delivery. So the potential here is actually to speed up delivery and save costs if we use this in the right way. And we don't need to, I think we need to be careful not to lose the potential here, as well as looking at the regulatory side of it.
I think we've covered largely earlier in the session about why historically we've struggled to incorporate good walking and cycling provision into new developments. But my question is partly about how new developments connect with what's already there. And often, you see a really nice wide LTN 120 slick tarmac in a new bit of path. So, for example, this new development in my Oxfordshire constituency of Valley Park near Didcot, but then it just suddenly stops, and then you've got back to the so-called cycle path, which is actually a pavement that someone's decided you can cycle on. I mean, how do you think the planning system can be used better to make sure that improvements, good quality infrastructure is put in, not just in those new developments, but they're leveraged to also get improvements funded and delivered as part of those in what already exists?
I think it goes back to the changes in the NPPF provide the opportunity to look at it in that way. I think if you're a developer and you're looking at the amount of, where you're looking at a site, you've got the red line boundary that determines what happens in that site. You have to deliver on that, and then you do have to connect with the surrounding infrastructure. The way that things work at the moment, and have done for a long time, is that a lot of the focus is on the amount of car-borne traffic or vehicular-borne traffic that will be created by the new development, and the language has been about mitigating the impact on surrounding roads. Generally, the only way to do that is through junction changes that Chris was alluding to, and things like that. A huge amount of cost then goes into doing things like moving utilities underneath road surfaces. Huge amounts of money that are being spent on widening junctions for this. if that money wasn't going into it in that way because a framework existed that has been facilitated by the NPPF for them to look at different ways of designing not only their site but also prioritising, for example, public transport connections to and from or other infrastructure, it's that balancing act. If you were to ask the development industry to do huge junction changes based on traffic generation and then also all of this other stuff, quickly sites would become unviable. If you can choose the vision of the site that you're actually trying to deliver and have a framework that people can operate and rely on, then you're in a position to change the type of sites that you deliver. I think it's worth noting within this context that the RTPI released just before Christmas a report that indicated that for the past 15 years most of the developments that have been delivered in the country have been car-borne or car-orientated and dominated. And so the changes in the NPPF brought forward by MHCRG create the opportunity for us to step into a different way of doing things.
Finally, in this section, we on the Transport Select Committee are always on the lookout for exciting visits, because so far all we've had is Old Oak Common, and some of us didn't even make that. Can you give us some examples of things which perhaps we might want to have a look at, which you might recommend, where you've seen improved walking and cycling provision successfully incorporated into either planned developments or things that have already happened?
I think for an example of how this can work in our country, and I actually mentioned it earlier, is just outside Ipswich, Kesgrave School, because it's not clever, it's not pretty, a lot of it's shared use path, but it works and it's connected and it's become part of the community. So they have a school which has lower than average body weight, higher attendance, after school attendance, and that's 800 to 900 kids a day riding in. That's worth looking at. That's just operating on our, and there's a few examples like that around the country that are worth seeing. We can send the committee a list. Actually.
Yeah, please do.
That would be useful because when I was Shadow Planning Minister, I saw an awful lot of really poor quality new developments with no provision for walking and cycling and built-in car dependency. So that would be really useful. Steph?
Yes, it's sort of the same question that Ollie asked, but about the department's integrated transport strategy. Just sort of do my little rant as I trailed earlier on. I remember in a previous life appealing to planners about a development that was lots of different red line boundaried settlements, 1,800 houses, the absolute essential need to design the whole scheme around a wide avenue for active travel going from the heart of the scheme to the heart of the town and connecting into transport options. And I just received a blank, dead-eyed stare in disbelief that I should suggest anything so ridiculous. With that in mind, and with what you've already said in response to Ollie, I guess I'm interested in what input you're having into the integrated transport strategy. What are your priorities for it? Maybe start there, please.
Yeah, well, as mentioned right at the start, quite a big influence in the ATE CEO is looking at that strategy now. He's actually tasked by his on secondment to DFT to actually go and look at it. And I think now that's a big change, I think, that the agency has made, is being part of conversations, and this is a demonstrable impact that's being had, and a true understanding that where does the client base come from for buses, trams and trains, how do they get to it? Yeah. So this is the unspoken of foundation of a functional public transport system, and it's seen regionally. We've mentioned the B network in Manchester, and now that learning is being taken nationally, and that integration is absolutely critical. And Dr. Arthur mentioned earlier that there's a potential for loss of bus journeys to cycling and walking. Yes, there is, but we generally benefit from that. But also for the longer journeys, if we can make this a normal thing to do, that I park up here, it's right next to, it's really easy, I tap on the bus, the fare is capped for the rest of the day. If we start to connect it up like that, that is the real potential. And we don't have to talk about active travel, it just becomes an integrated transport offer. I can mix and match as I choose. And that is the exciting conversation that's happening at the moment, to get out of silos into a transport offer. And we are very much embedded in that.
Very pleased to hear it. Thank you. You'll be aware that the Public Accounts Committee recommended, and I'm going to read this, DfT and Active Travel England should by April 24 develop a clear and consistent approach for ensuring greater integration of active travel infrastructure with the public transport network. Obviously the CEO is on secondment now as we speak. I just wondered to what extent that had actually been achieved, and when, if not last April, we might reach sort of some visible conclusion of that process.
It's live. It's not our project, so we are on the edge of that, and we are very much feeding into it. But it's a live piece of work right now, consultation happening around the country.
Thank you. Last couple of questions for me. I don't think we saw your strategic priorities for 25, 26 and beyond. Do you have a quick summary of them, or could you send us them?
Yes, we can definitely send you them.
We can definitely send them. We're taking them to the board next week.
Oh, fine. Right. That explains it.
They're
have them when I've seen them.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
you're quite right.
If you could send them
We
to us afterwards. Finally, the former Secretary of State promised unprecedented levels of funding for active travel. If you could have unprecedented levels of funding, what would you spend it on?
Well, Chris thinks one of the first things that I would start with is a massive push towards bringing more people into the industry. Because if you're going to invest unprecedented levels of investment into the built environment, and transport is all aspects of the built environment, then one of the starting points would be making sure that it's an attractive proposition to young people or people who want to change careers and develop what they can do, because you need a workforce to deliver it. And that doesn't just take into account planning and transport planning, it takes into account general workforce in terms of how you would go about delivering it.
I've finished thinking now.
Right, so.
I think going back to the capability ratings, that programme has been so successful that I would make sure that I would put consistency into the system based on capability. So you need training, you need more cash to get on with it, and that in turn would drive up both the quality, give us a pipeline of quality, and also allow local authorities to employ and invest in that officer base to be able to deliver these schemes, because they know it's coming. I think that would be it, would be consistently and delivered using that methodology.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your evidence today. Do feel free to write to us if there's anything you feel you haven't been able to cover in this session, and any answers that you felt you'd like to say more on. The session, I think we all found, has been really valuable. That concludes today's meeting. Order, order.